Shadows of clouds flicker across a landscape like the sparkle of waves at the bottom of a clear pool of water, reminding us that we are submerged in a substance, that substance being our atmosphere. The natural world does not reflect the order of our practical and aesthetic aims. It is raw and continuous. We observe continuity in the way a tree belongs to a grove, how the grove belongs to the forest, how the forest contributes to the soil, and so on. There is also continuity in the models we use to describe what cannot be perceived through the senses, the way a molecule resembles a cell or a solar system or a galaxy. We may notice the way a gentle stream meanders just as a surging river does, or as a snake moves. We may notice how the branches of a fallen tree resemble the antlers of a bull elk, or how patches of melting snow mirror the clouds above them. The natural world is the most salient manifestation of being. Everything we perceive conforms to our perceptive apparatus, and in this way, the objects we differentiate refer to us, to our human way of making sense of things. With different eyes, we would see a different world. With a different mind, we would understand a different world. So we must accept that we fail to apprehend reality for what it is in and of itself. Consider this landscape. We may begin to list what we see from this vantage point as mountains, trees, grass, rocks, but as we itemize the content of this experience, we begin to impose the discontinuity of the human world onto the continuity of nature. We itemize the world according to our needs. There is no true difference between a rock and a mountain. There are only rocks insofar as there is a need to differentiate a smaller example of granite from a larger one. I see a rock as having its own discrete existence because I may use it to cut flesh, to throw it as a weapon, or to hold down a towel on a breezy day at the beach. When I differentiate a ridge from a mountain, or a mountain from a mountain range, I'm once again differentiating according to my needs. When I differentiate a tree from a forest or from the soil it grows from, I am cutting it off from nature, from its continuity with everything else. And the criteria I use to differentiate one object from another has nothing to do with the objects themselves. Rather, it involves my needs and pursuits. When I single out a tree from its surroundings, it is because I recognize it as a place to sit beside, or to aim at, or to avoid, or to climb. As I single it out, I estrange it from the whole of its surroundings. I no longer see it embedded with everything. I take it as a part of me, as a means toward an end. It is no longer what it is. What it is hidden from me. It is left behind when singled out because everything I perceive is filtered through and limited by the gateway of my senses. Let us consider an individual tree more closely. If we ask ourselves, what is a tree? What is it made of? We may say that it is wood, that it is carbon, it is water, it is soil, it is a plant. When we describe it as wood, we describe it as a means to an end, as a material to build a home, or a chair, or to make a fire. If we describe it as something that grows from the ground, we are no longer describing it as a tree. We are instead referring to its nature, its relation to being. We begin to trace its existence to everything else. It grows with soil, water, and sunlight, and it roots itself into the ground, into the mountain it rests on. The soil is made of decomposed trees. As we attempt to understand its form, we are directed to see beyond its individuality. We only begin to understand the tree by dissolving it into an expanding awareness of nature, an expanding sense of being, of what exists. As we delve into the reality of the tree, we lose sight of it. We embed it into the continuity of nature. The boundaries of its form are suddenly no longer visible. The patterns that we observe in the natural world point towards a common source we cannot comprehend, but recognize as the source or ground of all things. The similarities between a snake meandering across the ground and a flowing river is not simply visual. Rather, we get a glimpse into the nature of gravity, of water, of thermodynamics, as ultimately responsible for the motion of the snake and the river. And despite the prodigious advancement of science, we never get a complete picture. We are always referred to a higher order of things, the whole of which is beyond comprehension. It is out of reach because there are limits to what the human mind can understand. In the Tao Te Ching, there is this repeated reference to the mysterious one, which is the source of the universe. The mysterious Tao is unseen because it is colorless. It is unheard because it is silent. If you try and grasp it, it will elude you because it has no form. The Tao translates to the way, and so we are thinking about something so fundamental that it exists as the common feature of all things. The concept of being is like this, although being implies something more static, whereas the way implies more of a trajectory or path. Our inquiry into the underlying nature of things brings us to the boundary of human intelligibility, the limits of what we can understand as finite beings. However, if we can recognize such a boundary, then we can conceive of another side. If we recognize the limitations of the human mind, then we can recognize that existence continues beyond the limitations of our perception and understanding. If we cannot cross the boundary of human intelligibility, what, if anything, can we say about that which exists beyond it? Consider the impossibility of inhabiting the point of view of another person. We may understand many things about neuroscience, but this understanding does not allow us to step into the experience of another person. We can measure fluctuations within someone else's brain, even predict what an individual is thinking or feeling based on these measurements, but we cannot step inside of the private experience of someone else. The issue of solipsism, which has troubled philosophers for millennia, does not prevent us from accepting that other persons have experiences as vivid as our own. This obvious conclusion in part derives from the pattern set by our own experience and its relation to our body. We understand that we have a body, a gateway for our consciousness to inhabit the physical world, and we see the bodies of others and effortlessly infer that they are conscious as we are. Another example of this boundary of intelligibility could be seen in the model of the Big Bang. If we accept that the universe is expanding, we immediately imply a space that it can expand into. This apparent contradiction reflects the inadequacy of our conceptual models. This has led some to think of reality as a simulation, imagining the birth of our universe like the turning on of a computer. 3. There is also the so-called hard problem of consciousness, a phrase made famous by the philosopher David Chalmers. The hard problem of consciousness is the challenge of explaining the phenomenal aspects of consciousness, what it's like to taste a lemon or watch a sunset, from merely understanding the mechanics of neuroscience. How do we get from the quantities of things to the qualities of things? How do we disentangle the activity of the brain as to understand the color blue or the feeling of love? These sensations, these experiences, correspond with physical activity within the brain. Understood as such, we have reduced human life and consciousness to carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, potassium, and every other element involved in the substance and chemistry of our body. When we look towards the horizon from the top of a ridgeline, we see the topography of Earth, unified, self-organized, and continuous. Once again, we are looking at chemistry. We are looking at carbon and oxygen and hydrogen and so on. We have established a pattern from which we may extrapolate some sense of reality beyond the boundary of our intelligibility. Could we be looking at a body of a living being? Could the ridges and features of the topography we see around us be like the ripples and folds of a brain? In other words, could everything at the most fundamental level be composed of consciousness? And is it possible that what we perceive as matter is simply the exteriority of consciousness, of mentality? If so, I would have no way of proving this to be the case, just as I have no way of inhabiting the experiences of another person. We are discussing that which exists on the other side of a boundary. I can gather no data about the other side. I am merely observing a pattern and extrapolating the continuation of this pattern beyond the horizon of the intelligible.